Welcome to my channel.
Morning drifted into Lockduff, as if it had forgotten what hour it was supposed to be. Wisps of mist clung stubbornly to the loch. Refusing to surrender to the pale Highland sun, the mountains stood in patient silence beyond the water, their shoulders wrapped in low cloud, while the sea breathed against the rocks with the lazy confidence of something that had been doing the same thing for thousands of years. For most folk, it looked like another ordinary day. For Police Constable Hamish Macbeth, that was exactly how he liked it. He leaned comfortably against an old stone wall overlooking the harbour, nursing a mug of strong coffee that had already gone lukewarm. His cap sat at a doubtful angle. His boots needed polishing, and his ginger hair looked as though it had recently argued with the wind and lost. Beside him lay his faithful dog, Lugs, whose sleepy eyes opened only long enough to confirm that nothing exciting appeared likely to happen. "Good," Hamish muttered. "Let's keep it that way." His police bicycle rested nearby, untouched since yesterday afternoon. The telephone at the station had rung twice already that morning. Hamish had thoughtfully not been there to answer it. There were advantages to serving a village where everyone knew everyone else's business before breakfast. If something truly serious happened, somebody would eventually come and fetch him. Until then, coffee deserved proper attention. The peaceful silence lasted exactly another 30 seconds. Mrs. Wellington, the village postmistress, appeared carrying an armful of parcels. "There you are," she called. "I've been looking all over." Hamish sighed inwardly. "I was easy enough to find. You were avoiding headquarters again. I was enjoying the scenery." She sniffed. "The scenery's been here longer than you." "Aye, and headquarters says you've not filed last week's reports. They're maturing." "Reports don't mature. They do, if you leave them long enough." Mrs. Wellington rolled her eyes in the practiced manner of someone who had known Hamish for years. "You'll never change?" "I hope not." She wandered off, shaking her head, already preparing to repeat the exchange to half the village before lunchtime. Hamish took another careful sip of coffee. Village gossip moved through Lockduff faster than electricity. It required neither wires nor encouragement. By the time he reached the Tommel Castle Hotel for breakfast, everyone seemed to be discussing the same subject. The Englishman, a millionaire, bought the old castle, plans to turn it into some luxury attraction. They say he's bringing helicopters. They say he's bringing television crews. They say he's charging £50 just to walk through the gardens. They always say, Hamish murmured. Inside the hotel dining room, warm smells of bacon, fresh bread, and coffee replaced the damp scent of sea air. Hamish settled into his favourite corner with a generous breakfast. The hotel owner placed another pot of coffee beside him. "Thought you'd need this? I nearly always do. You'll need it more today." "Oh, the new owner arrives this afternoon." Hamish looked only mildly interested. "Does he? Mr. Julian Ashcombe?" The name meant nothing. Apparently he's terribly important. "So are sheep, if you're a shepherd." The owner laughed. "They say he's restored castles all over England." "Has he now?" "And now he's bought Dunhaw Castle." That caught Hamish's attention. The old fortress stood on cliffs just beyond the village, abandoned for decades. Winds howled through its broken towers, gulls nested inside cracked battlements, and local children delighted in inventing ghost stories about it. No sensible Highlander wanted to own the place, which perhaps explained why an English businessman did. The hotel door burst open. Into the warmth strode a tall man wearing an expensive tailored coat completely unsuited to Highland weather. His polished shoes already carried splashes of mud. Behind him hurried an assistant, carrying 2 mobile telephones, a leather briefcase, and what looked suspiciously like bottled imported mineral water. Julian Ashcombe surveyed the room with practiced disappointment. "So this," he announced loudly, "is the famous Lockduff." Conversation stopped. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Even the fire seemed to crackle more quietly. Ashcombe smiled the sort of smile that never reached the eyes. "I must admit, photographs made it appear larger. No Highland village appreciated being insulted before lunch." Hamish continued eating. The newcomer approached the counter, I require the finest suite. You've booked it already, the owner replied evenly. And coffee. We have coffee. I hope it's drinkable. It's been good enough for everyone else. Ashcombe sighed dramatically. I suppose one must lower one's expectations. Hamish watched without appearing to watch. People often revealed themselves in the first 5 minutes. Ashcombe possessed the effortless confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Every sentence sounded less like conversation than instruction. He corrected the pronunciation of Scottish place names, despite saying them incorrectly himself. Within 10 minutes, he had offended the hotel owner, criticized the breakfast, complained about the weather, questioned the plumbing, and asked whether the village intended to modernize within this century. An impressive achievement. Outside, news spread with astonishing efficiency. By afternoon, fishermen discussed him on the harbour. The minister heard complaints after visiting parishioners. The grocer declared the man would never survive a Highland winter. Children had already invented insulting nicknames. By evening, everyone disliked Julian Ashcombe. Not because he was English. Lochdover had welcomed plenty of English visitors over the years. No, they disliked him because he behaved as though kindness were a weakness and courtesy an inconvenience. Hamish eventually wandered toward Dunhaw Castle. The old fortress dominated the cliffs above the sea, its weather-blackened stones glowing faintly beneath gathering clouds. Ashcombe stood directing contractors. No, no, remove that wall. It's 400 years old, sir. So, the Preservation Board, I own it. Hamish paused beside the gate. Ashcombe noticed him. And you are Paulus. The businessman looked disappointed. I expected someone more official. This is official enough. Ashcombe glanced over Hamish's untidy uniform. You'll have to ensure local people stay away. They generally go where they please. I don't think you understand. I usually manage. I've invested millions here. I expect cooperation. You'll likely get some. Ashcombe frowned. I was told Highland police were helpful. Hamish smiled pleasantly. We're helpful when we can be. The businessman turned away dismissively. I've no more time. Hamish looked up at the ancient towers. Wind whistled through empty windows like someone trying unsuccessfully to remember an old tune. The castle felt uneasy, not haunted, just disturbed. Construction workers exchanged nervous glances whenever Ashcombe barked another order. One elderly mason quietly packed his tools and left without explanation. A pair of ravens circled the highest turret before disappearing into the grey sky. Lugs gave a low growl. Hamish scratched the dog's ears. What is it then? The dog continued staring toward the castle. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps the weather, or perhaps the old building knew something its new owner did not. Hamish had learned long ago that villages possessed instincts. So did dogs. Neither should be ignored. As he strolled back toward Lochdover, rain began falling in thin silver threads across the hills. Behind him, the great castle disappeared into mist until only its tallest tower remained visible. It looked less like a home than a warning. By nightfall, every light burned inside Dunhaw Castle, and somewhere beyond those ancient walls, hidden beneath centuries of Highland stone, something had already begun moving toward murder. The rain settled over Lochdover during the night with the steady determination only Highland rain could manage. By dawn, it had softened to a mist that blurred the hills into grey shadows and turned every stone path into a ribbon of glistening slate. Hamish Macbeth woke later than he intended. He regarded the ceiling of the police station for a thoughtful minute before admitting to himself that there was no urgent reason to get up. Villages did not suddenly become disorderly before breakfast. Sheep escaped, dogs quarreled, someone complained about another person's hedge, but murder had the decency to remain uncommon. Lugs, however, had other ideas. The dog stood at the foot of the bed, ears pricked, giving a low, impatient whine. "Aye," Hamish murmured, swinging his legs over the side. "You've more ambition than I've ever had." He lit the stove, set the kettle on, and was just measuring coffee when someone hammered on the station door, hard enough to rattle the windows. Not good. Nobody knocked like that over wandering sheep. The knocking came again. Polis, Hamish, open up, Hamish sighed. There goes breakfast. Outside stood Angus MacLean, one of the fishermen from the harbour. The man's oilskins were soaked through despite the drizzle, and his normally weathered face had lost its usual healthy colour. It's the castle. Hamish reached automatically for his jacket. What about it? Something's happened? What sort of something? I think, Angus swallowed. I think the English gentleman's dead. Hamish looked at him for a long second. You think? I didn't go close enough to make certain. Why's the caretaker found him. Who else knows? Half the village by now. Of course they do. Within minutes. Hamish was cycling through the damp morning, with lugs running easily beside him. The road climbed toward Dunhaw Castle, the ancient fortress looming through curtains of mist, like a ship emerging from the sea. By the time he reached the gate, a respectable crowd had already gathered despite the rain. No Highlander wished to intrude. Every Highlander wished to know exactly what had happened. Mrs. Wellington stood beneath an umbrella, discussing events with the minister. I heard he'd fallen from the tower. My sister says he was stabbed. The grocer heard he'd been poisoned. It only happened half an hour ago, Hamish observed. Mrs. Wellington nodded cheerfully. That gives people plenty of time to think. The castle grounds were alive with nervous contractors, all speaking at once. Hamish lifted a hand, one at a time. Nobody listened. Eventually, an elderly man in a heavy tweed coat pushed through the crowd. I'm Malcolm Fraser, he said. Caretaker, you found him. I did. Show me. They crossed the muddy courtyard in silence. Yesterday, it had echoed with Julian Ashcombe's confident orders. Today it felt abandoned. Scaffolding creaked softly in the wind. Loose tarpaulins snapped against stone walls, like distant applause. Inside, the entrance hall smelled of damp masonry, fresh plaster, and something metallic beneath it all. Blood. Not much, just enough. Hamish stopped beside a polished marble floor that hadn't been there yesterday. Workmen had evidently been restoring the entrance overnight. Julian Ashcombe lay sprawled at the foot of the castle's grand staircase. He wore the same expensive coat as the previous afternoon, though one sleeve had been torn. His expression remained frozen in startled disbelief. An ornamental medieval helmet rested beside him. It might have suggested he had died from an accident, except the helmet was perfectly clean. The blood came from a narrow wound just beneath his left shoulder. Hamish crouched without touching anything. The wound was neat. Deliberate, someone had known precisely where to strike. His eyes wandered slowly around the hall. A shattered whiskey glass. One muddy footprint leading inward. Another leading away. Nothing overturned. No sign of struggle. Strange. Very strange. Lugs sniffed cautiously before backing away from the body with an uneasy whine. What did you see? Hamish asked quietly. The caretaker rubbed trembling hands together. I opened up at 6. Why? The masons start early. And the front door wasn't locked. It should have been, always. You came inside. I thought Mr. Ashcombe had started work. You found him? Aye. Did you touch anything? No. Anyone else? Only me until the villagers arrived. Hamish nodded, slowly. The staircase caught his attention. Rainwater glistened faintly on several stone steps. Yet the rest remained dry. Someone had entered from outside after the rain began. Or left. He followed the trail with his eyes. Halfway up the staircase stood a small table. On it rested an untouched silver coffee service. One cup, one pot, still warm. Hamish frowned. Ashcombe had expected company. The caretaker noticed where he was looking. I never put that there. No constable. Hamish filed the thought away. Outside, the distant growl of engines climbed the hillside. Several dark police vehicles appeared through the mist. Hamish closed his eyes for a brief moment. Here we go. The lead car stopped abruptly. Its driver scarcely waited before climbing out. Detective Chief Inspector Blair marched across the courtyard with the unstoppable force of an approaching storm. Thick-set, red-faced, and already irritated, he looked as though someone had personally arranged the murder simply to inconvenience him. "What have we got?" he barked before reaching the doorway. "Murder, likely. I can see that." His gaze settled on Hamish. "And you've probably trampled all over the evidence. I've barely moved. You usually do barely move." Several detectives behind Blair exchanged discreet smiles. Blair strode into the hall, glanced once at the body, and immediately announced, "Robbery." Hamish said nothing. "The fellow's rich," Blair continued. "Someone wanted his money." "The wallet's still there," Hamish observed. Blair ignored him. "Find the staff. Search every cottage. Lock the place down." One detective hesitated. "But, sir—" "I said robbery." Hamish looked again at the untouched coffee, at the single muddy footprint, at the carefully placed medieval helmet that looked almost theatrical. Nothing about the scene suggested panic. Nothing suggested theft. It looked arranged, as though someone wanted the body to tell a story that wasn't true. Blair rounded on him. "Well?" Hamish blinked innocently. "Well, what? Have you got one of your village theories already?" "Not yet." "Good. Leave proper police, work to professionals." Hamish inclined his head. "If you say so." Blair gave a satisfied grunt, believing, as he often did, that he had put the lazy village constable firmly in his place. That suited Hamish perfectly. Invisible policemen were rarely watched, and people who believed he was slow had an unfortunate habit of speaking freely in front of him. He stepped quietly back into the courtyard, while Blair's detectives flooded the castle. The villagers instantly surrounded him, with questions, whispers, and opinions. Hamish accepted none of them. Instead, he glanced once more toward the ancient entrance hall, where a dead man lay beside a coffee that had never been drunk. Someone had been invited into the castle that morning. Someone Ashcombe had expected. Someone close enough to sit down over coffee. And someone who had walked away alive while everyone else was still asleep. Morning spread slowly across Lochdover, though the village had little interest in admiring it. News of Julian Ashcombe's death had outrun the mist. Curtains twitched as neighbours watched police cars climbing toward Dunhaw Castle. Conversations that would ordinarily have centred on fishing, weather, or wandering sheep now revolved around a single question: who had wanted the Englishman dead? Hamish Macbeth let the gossip gather speed without trying to direct it. Gossip, if left alone, behaved like water. It found every crack. DCI Blair, on the other hand, believed in forcing rivers uphill. By mid-morning, he had assembled every contractor, cleaner, labourer, and gardener in the castle's great hall. The room echoed with impatient voices, and the scrape of boots across centuries-old flagstones. Blair stood before them, faced the colour of a boiled lobster. "One of you did it," he announced. "We'll save ourselves a great deal of time if the guilty party steps forward." "Silence," answered him. A mason coughed into his sleeve. A young electrician stared fixedly at the floor. The caretaker folded his hands behind his back. Blair's temper climbed another notch. "I'll not ask twice." No one moved. Hamish leaned against the doorway, apparently fascinated by a crack running through the ancient stone wall. Blair noticed him at once. "You," he snapped. Hamish looked up as though surprised to discover he was being addressed. "Me? Stop lurking." "I wasn't aware I was lurking." "You look like you're lurking." "I've always looked like this." A ripple of suppressed laughter ran through the workers. Blair wheeled around. Anyone smiling can explain themselves at headquarters. The laughter vanished. Satisfied that order had been restored, Blair began questioning the workers one by one. His method consisted largely of interrupting answers before they were finished. "You argued with him yesterday." "Aye, but so you admit it. He refused to pay for. That's motive." Another worker stepped forward. "He shouted at everyone, sir. So he made enemies." "Nearly everyone." "Excellent." Hamish listened quietly. Blair heard anger. Hamish heard something else. No one spoke of hatred. They spoke of irritation, of insults, of unpaid invoices. Enough to produce muttered curses over a pint. Not enough, perhaps, to produce murder. He slipped unnoticed from the hall. No one stopped him. Blair assumed he was wandering off to avoid work, which was exactly the impression Hamish preferred to leave. Outside, the rain had faded to a fine drizzle. Lugs trotted faithfully beside him as he circled the castle grounds. Construction materials lay scattered everywhere. Stacks of stone, timber beams, coils of rope. Work had halted so suddenly that half-filled wheelbarrows still stood where their owners had abandoned them. Hamish paused near the eastern wall. Fresh tire tracks cut through the mud. Several belonged to contractors' vans. One set was narrower. A car. The tread looked unusually expensive. The sort fitted to luxury saloons rather than battered work vehicles. He crouched. The tracks entered through the main gate. There were no matching tracks leaving. Curious. Unless the car remained somewhere nearby, or unless it had arrived before the rain and departed by another route. He stood and wandered toward a side entrance overlooking the cliffs. The heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar inside. A narrow corridor led toward the kitchens. The stone floor bore faint muddy marks, not boot prints, smaller, elegant shoes. Someone had entered this way after the rain began. Lugs sniffed the threshold before giving another uneasy growl. Hamish examined the lock. No damage, no sign of forcing. Whoever had come through this entrance had either possessed a key or been admitted willingly. His thoughts returned to the untouched coffee service upstairs. One pot, one cup, a meeting, planned, not accidental. He was still considering this when a familiar voice drifted across the courtyard. Constable Macbeth? He turned. Fiona Mackenzie, owner of the village cafe, hurried toward him carrying a covered basket. I thought you'd forgotten to eat. I nearly had. I made sandwiches. You're a blessing. I've also brought gossip. I suspected as much. They settled on a weathered stone bench overlooking the sea. Fiona poured tea into 2 enamel mugs. I served Mr. Ashcombe yesterday afternoon. Did you? He wasn't pleasant. I'd gathered that. He kept asking whether there were any respectable people living nearby. Hamish smiled faintly. And what did you tell him? I said he'd probably have to lower his expectations. She chuckled before becoming serious. He wasn't alone. Hamish stopped halfway through his sandwich. No, there was a woman. What sort of woman? Elegant, well-dressed, not local. English. I couldn't say. Age, 40s perhaps. Did they seem friendly? Not especially. What happened? They argued. About. I couldn't hear everything. She frowned, searching her memory. But she said something that made him go white. What was it? You can't bury the past behind thicker walls, she said. Hamish looked toward the castle rising above them. Anything else? He answered. No one here knows who I used to be. A cold breeze swept in from the sea. Hamish drank his tea without speaking. The woman had known Ashcombe before he arrived in Lockduff, perhaps long before, yet none of the villagers had mentioned seeing her, which meant she had come quietly and left quietly, or, perhaps, she had never left at all. At that very moment, an angry shout echoed from inside the castle. Blair. Even at this distance, there was no mistaking the voice. Moments later, one of the detectives came running across the courtyard. Sir, Inspector Blair wants Macbeth immediately. Hamish sighed. My lunch never lasts. He handed the remaining sandwich to Lugs, brushed the crumbs from his jacket, and strolled back toward the castle at an unhurried pace. He found Blair standing in the entrance hall, glaring at a young forensic photographer. What took you so long? Blair demanded. I was eating. You'll eat later. I was hoping to avoid that. Blair jabbed a finger toward the grand staircase. We found something. Halfway up the stairs, tucked beneath the carved banister, where it had escaped everyone's notice, lay a single black leather glove. Only one, expensive. Dry despite the damp air. Blair folded his arms triumphantly. There. Hamish looked at the glove, then at the staircase, then back at the glove. It wasn't there earlier, he said quietly. Blair snorted. Of course it was. I looked right here. You missed it, perhaps? But Hamish didn't believe it for a second. Someone had planted the glove after the police arrived, which meant the killer, or someone protecting the killer, was still inside Dunhaw Castle, walking among the investigators while pretending to help solve the murder. Hamish said nothing about the glove. Experience had taught him that contradicting Blair Too early only encouraged the inspector to dig himself deeper into the wrong conclusion. Better to let Blair charge ahead while everyone else relaxed. People became careless when they believed the police had already solved the puzzle. Blair bent to examine the glove with theatrical importance. High-quality leather, he declared, not the sort worn by honest workmen. One of the detectives carefully slipped it into an evidence bag. Check every laborer, Blair barked. If anyone's missing a glove, arrest him. Aye, sir. Hamish watched the detective disappear. A curious order. There had been nearly 30 people working at the castle. Half of them wore gloves. Some wore wool, others rubber, others thick builders' gauntlets. Yet Blair had already decided that one elegant leather glove belonged to the murderer. The conclusion had arrived long before the reasoning. Hamish wandered toward the window, overlooking the courtyard. Rain had begun again, tapping softly against the old glass. From here he could see contractors standing in uneasy little groups, talking in hushed voices. None looked like hardened killers. They looked like men wondering whether they would still have jobs by the end of the week. His attention drifted back to the staircase. Something still bothered him. Not the glove, the coffee. He climbed halfway up the stairs and stopped beside the small table where the silver coffee service remained untouched. The pot had gone cold. The cup was still full, no lipstick, no fingerprints, visible through the thin film of moisture. Just one untouched serving, he frowned. If Ashcombe had been expecting a guest, why had only one cup been prepared? Unless... He looked at the silver tray more carefully. A faint circular mark sat beside the remaining cup. Another cup had once rested there. Someone had removed it. Not broken it, removed it. The tray had been polished so thoroughly that only the slight difference in shine betrayed the missing piece. Hamish smiled almost imperceptibly. Now that was interesting. He heard footsteps behind him. It was the caretaker, Malcolm Fraser. You found something. Maybe the inspector doesn't think much of my opinions. He has enough opinions for everyone. The old caretaker chuckled. I've worked here 27 years. I thought the castle was abandoned. It mostly was. I stayed on to keep vandals out. You know every room? Every stone? Hamish rested a hand on the banister. Tell me about yesterday. Fraser thought for a moment. Mr. Ashcombe dismissed everyone around 6. So the workers all left, as far as I know. As far as you know. I left shortly after. And Mr. Ashcombe, he said he had a private appointment. Did he say with whom? No. Did he seem worried? The caretaker hesitated. Not worried. What then? Agitated. In what way? He kept checking his watch. Hamish nodded. A man waiting. Yes, he expected someone important. So it seemed. What happened next? I locked the west gate before I went home. The west gate? It leads down to the old cliff path. I noticed it standing open this morning. So did I. They looked at one another. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Hamish asked quietly, Who has keys? Myself. Mr. Ashcombe. Yes, anyone else? The architect. The architect? A woman from Edinburgh. Name. Evelyn Ross. Where is she? Fraser looked uncomfortable. That's the odd thing. What? Nobody's seen her today. Hamish felt the familiar little tightening in his stomach that came whenever scattered pieces began edging toward one another. An architect with a key. A mysterious woman arguing with Ashcombe. A private evening appointment. A missing coffee cup. An open gate. And now, a missing architect. Before he could ask another question, shouting erupted from below. Blair again. Hamish descended the staircase at his usual unhurried pace. The inspector was standing nose to nose with a broad-shouldered mason named Duncan Campbell. I've had enough lies. I've told you the truth. You threatened the victim. So did half the village. You admitted saying you'd kill him. I said I'd kill him if he knocked down the chapel wall. So you confess. I confess to losing my temper. Blair rounded triumphantly on his detectives. Take him. 2 officers stepped forward. Duncan's face darkened with disbelief. You can be serious. Oh, I'm serious enough. Hamish cleared his throat. Blair glared. What now? When exactly did Mr. Campbell make the threat? Blair looked irritated by the interruption. Yesterday afternoon. Hamish turned to Duncan, who heard it. Everyone, the workers nodded. He shouted it across the courtyard. Aye, clear as day. Hamish looked back at Blair. So the killer announced his intentions before 20 witnesses. Blair folded his arms. Criminals are often stupid. They can be. This one certainly was. Maybe. Blair frowned. What do you mean, maybe? Hamish scratched lugs behind the ears before answering. If I were planning murder, I'd be less noticeable. Blair snorted. Fortunately, you're too lazy to plan anything. A few of the detectives laughed. Hamish smiled pleasantly. That's true enough. Blair took the smile as surrender. Remove Campbell. The mason was led away, protesting loudly. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Hamish noticed something curious. No one looked frightened by Duncan's arrest. They looked puzzled. Even Duncan himself seemed more insulted than terrified. It wasn't the reaction of villagers who believed the murderer had been caught. It was the reaction of people watching a misunderstanding unfold. Hamish wandered outside again, letting the cool drizzle clear his thoughts. The cliff path stretched below the castle, winding between heather and jagged rocks, until it disappeared beside the sea. Very few visitors knew it existed. Locals did. He followed it at an easy pace. Lugs suddenly darted ahead, nose close to the ground. What have you got? The dog stopped beside a patch of flattened heather near the edge of the path. Hamish crouched. There, half hidden beneath wet grass, lay a broken strand of pearls. Not expensive costume jewelry. Real pearls. The silk thread had snapped violently. Several beads remained tangled among the heather, while others had rolled toward the cliff edge. He picked up one pearl between finger and thumb, cold. Still, faintly lustrous despite the rain. A woman had been here recently, perhaps struggling, perhaps fleeing. He slipped the pearl carefully into his pocket. Then he noticed something else. A footprint, small, elegant. The same narrow sole pattern he had seen by the side entrance. The print led toward the castle, not away from it. Hamish straightened slowly. Whoever wore those shoes had climbed to the castle before Julian Ashcombe died. But there were no matching footprints returning down the path. Either the woman had left another way, or she had never left the castle at all. Hamish remained on the cliff path for another minute, letting the drizzle soak into his jacket while he studied the disturbed patch of heather. The pearls had not been there long. Rain would have washed them farther downhill if they had lain exposed through the night. Luggs sniffed carefully around the spot before wandering a few yards farther along the path. He stopped beside a clump of gorse and gave a single sharp bark. What is it now? Hamish pushed the thorny branches aside. Caught on one of the spines was a narrow strip of dark blue fabric, no longer than a finger. It had been torn cleanly from a woman's coat or dress. He eased it free without damaging it. Good quality wool. Expensive. Not something one would expect to see on the work clothes of the castle labourers. He tucked it into an envelope from his notebook and slipped it into his pocket beside the pearl. 2 small clues. Neither proved anything. Together, they suggested someone had come to the castle by the cliff path in a hurry, or had left it the same way. Yet the footprints led only uphill. That continued to trouble him. Back at the castle, Blair's investigation had gathered all the subtlety of a military invasion. Detectives hurried from room to room, carrying boxes, notebooks, and cameras. Workers stood in miserable groups under temporary shelters, while officers checked names against payroll records. Blair himself had established headquarters in what had once been the castle library. He looked up as Hamish entered. "Where have you been? Walking? I've officers interviewing suspects while you're out admiring the scenery. It helps me think." "You should try thinking indoors." Hamish merely nodded. Blair interpreted silence as defeat. "We've made excellent progress. Have you?" The mason will crack. Duncan Campbell. A guilty conscience always cracks. Hamish leaned casually against the doorframe. "Has anyone found the missing coffee cup?" Blair blinked. "What coffee cup?" The second one, there wasn't one, there was. Nonsense. Hamish walked to the silver tray that had been brought into the library with the other evidence. Without touching it, he pointed to the faint ring left on the polished silver. Summono removed a second cup. Several detectives leaned closer. One quietly murmured, "He's right." Blair's face darkened. "That proves nothing." "No, it could have been moved yesterday. It could." Blair folded his arms triumphantly. "There you are." Hamish smiled. "It could also mean the victim shared coffee with someone shortly before he died." The room fell silent. One detective cleared his throat. "Sir, perhaps we should try locating the missing cup." Blair shot him a look capable of freezing whiskey. "Very well." The detective escaped gratefully. Hamish wandered out before Blair could think of another argument. The village cafe had become the unofficial headquarters of public opinion. Every table held at least one theory. Mrs. Wellington believed foreign investors were responsible. The minister suspected an old family feud. Two fishermen were convinced smugglers had returned to the coast after 50 years. Only Fiona Mackenzie appeared interested in facts. She poured Hamish a fresh mug of coffee before he asked, "You look wet, I am? You also look as though you found something. Maybe." "You always say maybe. It saves changing my mind later." She laughed. "I remembered something." Hamish looked up. "The woman I told you about yesterday. The one who argued with Ashcombe." "Yes? What about her?" "She asked me a strange question before she left." "What question?" "Is there another road to the castle?" Hamish felt a flicker of interest. "What did you tell her?" "I mentioned the cliff path. You actually showed her. I drew it on a napkin. Do you still have it?" "I'm afraid not." "What happened to it?" "She tucked it into her handbag. So she didn't know the area?" "No, and she'd never visited before." "I don't think so." Fiona hesitated. "There was something else." Hamish waited. When Mr. Ashcombe arrived, he acted as though he didn't recognize her. But the moment she spoke, his face changed. How? As if he'd seen a ghost. Leaving the cafe, Hamish strolled toward the harbour. The fishermen were repairing nets despite the weather. Old Ewan Morrison sat exactly where he always did, mending rope with slow, weathered hands. If anyone had noticed unusual visitors, it would be Ewan. Hamish sat beside him without speaking. After several quiet minutes, Ewan nodded toward the castle. "Bad business." "Aye, they'll blame the wrong man. You think so?" "I know Duncan. So do I. He loses his temper every Tuesday, and never lasts longer than 5 minutes." Hamish smiled. "Anything unusual yesterday?" Ewan continued working the rope. "A motorboat. That caught Hamish's attention." "What sort?" "Small cabin cruiser." "When?" "Near sunset." "Where?" "Below the castle cliffs." "Did it land?" "No, it just waited." "For how long?" "Half an hour. Maybe." "Anion aboard?" "I saw only one figure." "Man or woman?" "Couldn't tell." "Did anyone come ashore?" Ewan shook his head. Mist was too thick. "Did it leave?" "Yes." "Which direction?" "North." Hamish looked thoughtfully across the grey water. The castle had 3 possible approaches. The main road, the cliff path, the sea. Had someone come by boat while everyone watched the front gate? Or had someone been waiting offshore for another reason entirely? Late that afternoon, one of Blair's detectives found Hamish outside the police station. "The inspector wants you." "Does he?" "Immediately." Hamish sighed. "He usually does." Inside the castle library, Blair looked unusually pleased. "We've identified your mysterious woman." Hamish raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" Blair tossed a leather folder onto the desk. "Evelyn Ross, the architect, the same. Where is she now?" "We don't know. But we've learned plenty." Blair tapped several documents. "She worked with Ashcombe on 3 previous restoration projects." Hamish opened the folder. Contracts, planning applications, photographs of old manor houses. In every picture, Ashcombe stood smiling beside the same elegant, dark-haired woman, Evelyn Ross. They looked less like employer and architect than long-time partners. "There," Blair said smugly. That's interesting. It gets better. Blair pulled out another sheet. A witness saw them arguing in Edinburgh last month. What about? No idea. But they argued. So she's vanished. Hamish nodded slowly. She has. Blair grinned. Which makes her our prime suspect. Hamish closed the folder. Or our next victim. The smile disappeared from Blair's face. What if she came to meet Ashcombe and never left the castle? Blair interrupted sharply. She fled. Perhaps that's the obvious explanation. Hamish looked toward the rain-streaked window. It usually isn't. Before Blair could reply, a constable burst into the room, breathless from running. Sir, what now? We've searched Miss Ross's room at the hotel, and there are clothes. Yes, her suitcase. Blair's impatience boiled over. Out with it, man. The constable swallowed hard. Everything's still there. Blair frowned. So, everything except the shoes she was wearing yesterday. A silence settled over the room. Hamish's thoughts returned instantly to the narrow footprints on the cliff path. If Evelyn Ross had fled after the murder, why would she leave behind every possession she owned? And if she hadn't fled, then somewhere inside, Dunhaw Castle, hidden among its forgotten chambers and ancient walls, there might still be someone who had never truly escaped. The discovery of Evelyn Ross's untouched luggage lingered in Hamish's thoughts long after he left Blair's improvised headquarters. A person who intended to disappear usually took more than the shoes on their feet. Clothes could be replaced, but passports, money, and personal papers were another matter. Evelyn's room contained all of them, neatly arranged as though she expected to return before supper. That did not sound like a fugitive. It sounded like someone whose plans had been interrupted. By evening, the rain had eased, leaving the air cool and heavy with the scent of wet pine and sea salt. The village settled into its familiar rhythm despite the murder. Lamps glowed behind cottage windows. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the hotel dining room filled with subdued conversation. Hamish chose a quiet corner, with a bowl of stew and another pot of coffee. He had barely lifted his spoon when Elspeth Grant slipped into the chair. Opposite him, she was carrying a notebook, though it remained closed. I wondered how long it would take you to notice me, she said. I noticed. You said nothing. I was hoping you'd let me finish my stew. She smiled. You never change. I've tried. It seemed like unnecessary effort. Elspeth laughed softly before her expression grew serious. The newspapers already have the story. I expected they would. They're calling Ashcombe a visionary who planned to revive the Highlands. Hamish raised an eyebrow. The villagers seemed to have formed a different opinion. They certainly have. She leaned closer. I've been asking questions. I thought journalists preferred calling it investigating. We borrow from gossip whenever possible. What have you learned? She opened her notebook. Ashcombe wasn't nearly as wealthy as people believed. Hamish stopped eating. No, he borrowed heavily to buy Dunhaw Castle. From whom? A London investment company, and, if the restoration failed, he stood to lose almost everything. Hamish stirred his stew absent-mindedly. So money wasn't as plentiful as it appeared. Exactly. Elspeth turned another page, and there is something else. What? The castle. Hamish looked up. What about it? A historian told me Dunhaw has one feature that rarely appears on modern maps. He waited. A priest's passage. A what? A concealed route built during the 17th century. Hamish leaned back. I've never heard of it. Neither had I. It still exists? No one knows. The historian sounded certain. He said, old Highland castles often included hidden stairways, connecting private chambers to the chapel or the cliffs. Hamish's eyes drifted toward the dark outline of the castle, visible beyond the hotel windows. A hidden passage. If someone had used it, the missing footprints, the open gate, the absent coffee cup. Suddenly, the castle seemed much larger than anyone had realized. The next morning, Hamish arrived at Dunhaw before Blair. It was one of the few advantages of living in Lochduff. The castle belonged to the village before it belonged to headquarters. Malcolm Fraser was already unlocking the front door. You're early. So are you. I couldn't sleep. I doubt many people did. Inside, the building seemed unnaturally quiet. The restoration work had stopped completely. No hammers, no saws. Only the distant cry of gulls, drifting through empty corridors. Hamish walked slowly through the entrance hall, allowing his eyes to wander over details he had ignored the previous day. Ancient portraits, cracked plaster, fresh scaffolding. Then something caught his attention. One of the portraits hung slightly crooked. Not much, just enough. He straightened it automatically. Instead of settling against the wall, the heavy frame swung inward another inch before stopping. Hamish frowned. That shouldn't happen. He gently pulled the portrait toward him. Behind it lay a narrow recess cut into the stone. Inside was an old iron lever. He looked around. No one. Curiosity overcame caution. He pulled the lever. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, somewhere deep within the wall, came the slow grinding of ancient stone. Malcolm Fraser looked up sharply. "Did you hear that?" "Aye." The sound ended with a dull thud. Together, they followed it along the corridor until they reached the old castle chapel. A section of carved wooden paneling had shifted open by only a few inches. Fraser stared in astonishment. "I've worked here 27 years. You never knew." "Never." Hamish eased the hidden panel farther open. Cold, stale air drifted out. Beyond it lay a narrow stone staircase, descending into darkness. Lugs immediately growled. Hamish scratched the dog's head. "I know." The caretaker found an old lantern. Its yellow light revealed centuries of dust coating the steps. Except not all of them. Near the bottom, several footprints disturbed the dust. Recent footprints. Someone had used the passage. Recently, very recently, Hamish crouched beside the nearest print, small. The same narrow sole he had seen outside. A woman's shoe. He continued downward. The staircase twisted beneath the castle, before opening into a low tunnel with rough stone walls. Cobwebs hung undisturbed across most of the ceiling. Not all. One web had been broken only hours before. At the far end stood another concealed door. Hamish pushed gently. It opened onto a tiny chamber overlooking the sea through a narrow slit window. The room contained almost nothing. An old wooden chair, a rusted lantern, and a single wine glass sitting on the windowsill. Fresh fingerprints clouded its surface. Someone had been here, waiting, watching. He examined the floor. More footprints, the same elegant shoes, but alongside them a much larger set. Men's boots. 2 people had occupied the chamber. One had been Evelyn Ross. Who had the other been? Malcolm Fraser suddenly called from behind. "Constable." Hamish turned. "What is it?" The caretaker's voice sounded uneasy. "There is something here." He pointed toward the corner. Half hidden beneath an old blanket lay a leather document case. Expensive, dark brown. Its brass clasp bore the initials. Jar Julian Ashcombe. Hamish carefully opened it. Inside were architectural drawings of the castle. Most appeared ordinary. One, however, had been folded separately. He spread it across the chair. It showed the castle's foundations. Several rooms had been marked in red pencil. One room, deep beneath the oldest tower, had been circled repeatedly. Across the margin, Ashcombe had written just 3 hurried words. "Find it first." Hamish studied the map in silence. Whatever Julian Ashcombe had come to Dunhaw Castle to restore, it wasn't just an old building. He had been searching for something hidden beneath it. And if someone had been willing to kill to keep that secret buried, the murder was no longer just about an argument, a grudge, or wounded pride. The castle itself had become part of the mystery. Hamish folded the marked plan with deliberate care and slipped it into a large evidence envelope. He did not intend to mention it to Blair just yet. If the inspector learned there was talk of hidden rooms and secret passages, he would have half the castle demolished before lunchtime. That suited neither the investigation nor the castle. Malcolm Fraser remained staring at the chamber. "I've never seen this room. It wasn't meant to be seen. But someone's been using it." The caretaker looked toward the sea-facing slit window. "You could watch every boat entering the bay from here." Hamish walked over to the opening. The view was narrow but commanding. Below, waves crashed against black rocks, while farther out the fishing boats looked like tiny specks on the steel-grey water. He remembered old Johan Morrison's story. A cabin cruiser had lingered offshore around sunset. From this hidden room, whoever waited here would have seen it perfectly. Not only seen it, expected it. By the time they climbed back into the chapel, Blair's voice was already echoing through the castle. Macbeth, Hamish exchanged a glance with Fraser. I suppose we'd better face the weather. The weather, Inspector Blair. They found him in the entrance hall, surrounded by detectives. His face had achieved an impressive shade of crimson. Where have you been? Wandering. I told you to stop wandering. I don't recall agreeing. Blair jabbed a thick finger toward him. I've got new evidence. So have I. What? Hamish smiled mildly. I found a loose stone. Blair looked momentarily confused, before dismissing him with a snort. I've no time for your Highland nonsense. He turned triumphantly to the others. We've examined Duncan Campbell's cottage. Several detectives waited expectantly. We found blood. A murmur spread through the room. Hamish merely asked. Human. Blair hesitated. We're sending it for testing. Where was it? On his jacket. The jacket he wears cutting sandstone? Yes, Hamish nodded. Then it could belong to anyone who scraped a hand. Blair's triumph deflated slightly. You've always got an answer. Only questions. They're equally annoying. One of the younger detectives approached cautiously. Sir, what? We also found this. He handed Blair a folded receipt, recovered from Duncan's pocket. Blair read it aloud. MacLeod Hardware. One claw hammer. He looked around dramatically. The murder weapon. Hamish blinked. Was the victim killed with a hammer? No. Then why is it the murder weapon? Blair frowned. It could have been. Hamish decided further discussion would achieve nothing. Instead of remaining inside, he wandered down to the harbour. The tide was beginning to fall, exposing long stretches of seaweed, covered rock. Old Johan was repairing lobster creels. You've come back. I forgot to ask something. What now? The cabin cruiser. Aye. Did you recognize it? Johan shook his head. No name painted where I could see. Anything unusual? The fisherman scratched his beard. It kept its engine running, never anchored. No. Someone ready to leave in a hurry. So I thought. Did anyone signal it? Johan paused. Now that you mention it. Go on. I saw a light. What sort of light? A lantern? From where? The castle. Hamish's attention sharpened. Which window? I couldn't tell exactly. But it wasn't one of the main windows. No, it was lower. Near the cliffs. Hamish thanked him and walked thoughtfully back toward the village. A hidden room overlooking the sea. A waiting boat, a lantern signal. Someone had arranged a meeting long before Ashcombe died. That afternoon, Elspeth Grant arrived at the police station, carrying a cardboard archive box. I've brought presents. Hamish looked inside. Newspapers, old ones. Should I be grateful? You will be. She spread yellowed newspaper clippings across his desk. They're all about Julian Ashcombe. Hamish poured coffee for both of them. I thought he'd made his fortune restoring castles. So did everyone. She selected one article. He actually began as an antiques dealer. Then several collections under his care developed mysterious gaps. Things went missing. Valuable things. Were charges brought? No. Why not? Nothing could be proved. Hamish read another clipping. Several historic estates. Private collections. Missing artifacts. Insurance, settlements. Ashcombe's name appeared again and again. Always nearby. Never guilty. Elspeth slid over the oldest article. This one's interesting. It described the restoration of Blackwood Hall 20 years earlier. Halfway through the project, workers had uncovered a concealed priest hole containing 17th century church silver. Within a week, several priceless pieces had vanished. Ashcombe had denied all knowledge. The theft had never been solved. Hamish leaned back. So he wasn't restoring castles. What do you mean? He was hunting them. Elspeth frowned. Hunting? Hidden rooms? Lost treasures? Forgotten collections? She slowly nodded. You think that's why he bought Dunhor? I think he believed something valuable was hidden beneath it, and someone else believed it too. Late that evening, Hamish returned alone to the secret chamber. This time he carried only a lantern. He searched every inch of the small room. Dust, stone, rotting, timber. Nothing. Then lugs began scratching at the floor beside the old chair. What have you found? The flagstone sounded hollow when Hamish tapped it. He examined the edges. Unlike the others, it showed fresh scrape marks. Someone had lifted it recently. Using the tip of an old iron poker, he carefully pried the stone upward. Beneath lay a shallow cavity. Empty. Completely empty. Except for one folded envelope. Its paper had yellowed with age. Across the front, in faded ink, someone had written, "To the finder of Dunhor's secret." The seal had already been broken. Someone had opened it before. Hamish unfolded the brittle sheet. The handwriting was elegant but hurried. The treasure is not gold, nor silver, nor jewels. Those who seek riches will destroy this castle for nothing. The true inheritance lies beneath St. Columba's tower, where the names of the innocent were hidden from the crown. Guard them well, for greedy men would burn history to protect themselves. There was no signature, only a date. 1693. Hamish read the letter twice. Then a third time. No treasure, no jewels, just records, old records. His mind raced. Ashcombe had spent a lifetime chasing hidden valuables. If he had found this letter, he would have realized the real secret wasn't treasure at all. Unless he looked again at the empty compartment. Someone else had reached it first. Someone had taken whatever had once been hidden beneath St. Columba's tower. The letter had been left behind because, to a treasure hunter, it appeared worthless, but to someone who understood history, it was priceless. As Hamish carefully folded the fragile document, a floorboard creaked somewhere beyond the hidden chamber. He froze. Lug's ears snapped upright. Another creak, soft. Careful. Someone else was inside the secret passage. And unlike Hamish, they were moving without a lantern. Hamish lowered the lantern flame until it was no more than a dull amber glow. Darkness settled over the hidden chamber. He rested one hand lightly on Lug's collar. The dog had already fixed his gaze on the narrow passage beyond the doorway. He gave no bark this time, only a low rumble deep in his throat. Someone knew these tunnels well enough to walk them in near darkness. That was not encouraging. Another faint scrape echoed through the stone corridor. Not hurried, not frightened, measured. Whoever it was believed they were alone. Hamish stepped silently into the passage, placing each foot where centuries of use had worn the stone smooth. The old walls swallowed sound, leaving only the distant drip of water and the whisper of his own breathing. The footsteps stopped silence. Then, a flash of movement. A dark figure darted across the far end of the passage. "Police," Hamish called evenly. "There is nowhere to go." The reply came in the form of running feet. "So much for conversation," he muttered. He broke into a sprint. The passage twisted sharply beneath the castle. His shoulder brushed damp stone as he rounded a corner. Ahead, the fleeing figure knocked over an old wooden crate that burst apart with a deafening crash. Lugs bounded past him. Easy, the dog disappeared into the darkness. Hamish followed the sound of claws skidding across stone. The tunnel divided into two narrow branches. He stopped. Which way? Lugs answered for him, barking from the passage leading toward the cliffs. Hamish hurried after him. Cold sea air drifted toward him. The tunnel was opening somewhere outside. He emerged onto a narrow ledge carved into the cliff face, invisible from above. Waves exploded against the rocks 30 feet below. Lugs stood at the edge, barking furiously. But the ledge was empty. The stranger had vanished. Hamish scanned the cliff. A thick rope hung down the rock face, swaying gently in the wind. Fresh. Someone had climbed down only moments earlier. He leaned over carefully. Far below, A small motorboat was pulling away from the base of the cliffs. Its engine growled softly as it turned toward open water. Hamish could make out only one person aboard. A figure in a dark waterproof coat, too far away to identify. Within seconds, the boat disappeared into the mist. He looked at the rope again. Professional climbing rope, not something carried by chance. Someone had planned this escape long before tonight. The following morning, Blair was in unusually good spirits. That alone made Hamish suspicious. The inspector strode into the castle dining room, waving a sheet of paper. "We've got her." Hamish looked up from his coffee. "Have you, Evelyn Ross? You've found her?" "No." "Then what have you got?" "A bank transfer." Blair slapped the paper onto the table. "Ashcombe paid her £50,000 last week." Hamish read the statement. The payment was genuine. That's a large sum. It's motive, or salary. No architect earns that. Some do. Blair ignored him. She argued with him. Yes, she vanished. Also true. She took his money. We don't know that. Blair smiled with enormous satisfaction. "I've already circulated her description." Hamish folded the paper. "If she's innocent, she'll never come forward now." Blair's smile faded. Why would an innocent woman hide? Perhaps because she believes the police have already decided she's guilty. Blair snorted. "That's because she is." Hamish decided there was little point arguing. Instead, he visited the village solicitor, Andrew Sinclair, whose office overlooked the harbour. Sinclair greeted him with evident unease. "I expected someone from Strathbane. They're busy." "I imagine they are." Hamish accepted a cup of coffee. "I've a question about Julian Ashcombe." The solicitor removed his spectacles. "I handled the purchase of Dun Hor. So you knew him, as well as one can know a client in 3 meetings. Did anything strike you as unusual?" Sinclair hesitated. "There was one thing." "What?" "He insisted the sale include every document relating to the estate. Old records. Everything. Maps, letters, inventories, even church papers." Hamish nodded slowly. "And if they couldn't be found?" He became irritated. "Were they found?" "Most of them." "Most." A chest of estate papers disappeared sometime during the 1,920 seconds. "What sort of papers?" "The family archive." "Did it contain anything valuable?" The solicitor shrugged. "Only to historians. Not treasure. No. Names, land records, baptisms, tenancies, letters." The words from the old note echoed in Hamish's mind. The names of the innocent. Ashcombe had not merely been searching for hidden gold. He had been searching for missing records. But why? What could 17th century documents possibly reveal that was worth killing for? That evening, Elspeth arrived at the police station, carrying another notebook. "You look pleased," Hamish observed. "I found Evelyn Ross." Hamish nearly spilled his coffee. "You what?" "Well, I found someone who knew her." "Go on." "A retired architect in Inverness. And he worked with her for years." "What did he say?" Elspeth's expression became thoughtful. "He laughed when I mentioned hidden treasure." "Why?" "He said Evelyn hated treasure hunters." She specialized in preserving historical archives. Not restoring buildings. That too. But mostly she searched for forgotten records before renovations destroyed them." Hamish stared into his coffee. Everything shifted. If Evelyn had devoted her career to preserving history, and Ashcombe had spent his career profiting from discoveries, then they had not been partners. They had been opponents forced to work together. He stood abruptly. "Lugs." The dog was already on his feet. "Where are you going?" Elspeth asked. "Back to the castle." "Why?" "Because I've been asking the wrong question." "What should you have been asking?" Hamish reached for his coat. Not who wanted Julian Ashcombe dead. He paused at the door. But what he found before he died. As he stepped into the gathering dusk, neither he nor Elspeth noticed the figure standing across the street beneath a dripping oak tree. The stranger wore a dark raincoat with the collar turned high. They watched Hamish leave without moving. Only after he had disappeared toward the castle did the figure quietly remove a single black leather glove from a pocket. It matched the one the police had discovered on the staircase. The stranger looked at it for a long moment, then, with a faint smile, dropped it into the swollen river, where the current carried it silently out toward the sea. Dusk settled over Lockduff with the quiet certainty of the tide. A cool wind swept in from the sea, carrying the scent of kelp and rain across the darkening hills. By the time Hamish reached Dunhaw Castle, the last of Blair's detectives had gone back to Strathbane. Satisfied they had done enough for one day. Satisfied, Hamish reflected, was not the same as right. Malcolm Fraser was locking the front gate. "I thought you'd finished." "I thought so too." The caretaker studied Hamish's expression. "You've had another idea?" "I've had too many." Fraser smiled faintly and unlocked the gate again. Inside, the castle seemed to breathe with the wind. Old beams creaked overhead, and somewhere deep within the walls came the soft, rhythmic drip of water. Hamish carried the marked foundation plan beneath his arm. "Take me to St. Columba's Tower," Fraser frowned. "There isn't much left of it." "Enough, I hope." The tower occupied the oldest corner of the castle, its walls thicker than anywhere else in the building. Restoration work had barely begun there. Broken stone lay in neat piles, while centuries of dust coated the uneven floor. Hamish unfolded Ashcomb's plan. The red circle lay directly beneath the tower. He walked slowly across the room. Nothing, just cracked flagstones and scattered debris. Lugs, however, ignored the center entirely. Instead, the dog wandered toward the ancient fireplace. "What have you found?" Lug sniffed at the hearth before pouring twice at the soot-blackened stone. Hamish knelt. The fireplace was enormous, built for logs far larger than any burned today. He ran his hand along the inner wall. Cold stone, then wood. His fingers stopped. Someone had fitted a narrow oak panel inside the masonry. "So that's how you hid it." Fraser fetched a lantern. Together, they examined the panel until Hamish located a tiny iron catch disguised as an old nailhead. The panel swung inward. Behind it lay a cramped passage descending beneath the tower. "This castle's full of secrets," Fraser whispered. "It kept them for 300 years. They climbed carefully down worn steps into a circular chamber, unlike any Hamish had yet seen. Shelves lined the walls. Most had collapsed long ago. Fragments of mouldering parchment littered the floor. An ancient wooden chest stood open in one corner. Empty? Someone had already been there. Hamish crouched beside it. Fresh scrape marks scored the stone where the heavy chest had recently been dragged. Not centuries ago, days ago. Ashcombe had found the chamber, but he had not found it empty. Someone else had removed its contents. Back upstairs, Hamish remained silent for several minutes. Pieces that had seemed unrelated were beginning to fit. Ashcombe bought castles with hidden histories. Evelyn Ross preserved historical records. A mysterious boat waited offshore. A secret chamber had been emptied shortly before the murder. The killer had planted false evidence after the police arrived. It no longer looked like a murder committed in sudden anger. It looked prepared, carefully, patiently. Someone had known exactly what lay beneath St. Columba's Tower before Ashcombe ever reached Lockduff. The question was, who? The answer began, unexpectedly, with tea. The following morning, Hamish visited Mrs. Wellington under the respectable excuse of collecting his mail. She greeted him with a knowing smile. "You've not come for letters. I've come for tea and gossip. That too." Within minutes, he sat in her kitchen with a mug in one hand and a warm scone in the other. Mrs. Wellington required remarkably little encouragement. "The whole village is talking, so I hear. They've all got it wrong." Hamish looked up. "Have they?" "Oh, yes." She lowered her voice, although nobody else was present. "Everyone keeps asking about strangers." "Aye, but nobody asks about locals." Hamish buttered another piece of scone. "Go on." "The castle wasn't empty before Mr. Ashcombe bought it." "No, there was another visitor." "When?" "For months." "Who?" "I never learned his name." "What did he look like?" "Tall, grey hair, always polite." "English?" "I'd say so." "What was he doing?" "He told people he was writing a history of the MacFarlane family." Hamish's attention sharpened. Did anyone see him inside the castle? Oh yes, the caretaker let him wander about. He spent hours there. When did he leave? The week before Mr. Ashcombe arrived. Hamish set down his cup. Did he ever speak to Julian Ashcombe? Not that anyone saw. What about Evelyn Ross? Mrs. Wellington thought carefully. I don't believe so. A historian, or someone pretending to be one, living quietly in Lochdovex, exploring the castle long before its new owner arrived. That was no coincidence. Hamish went straight to Malcolm Fraser. The caretaker's face fell the moment he heard the description. I know who she means, you do. He called himself Professor Charles Morton, a real professor. I never checked. What was he studying? The castle. For how long? Nearly 4 months. What did he do all day? Took measurements, drew sketches, read old inscriptions. He asked endless questions. Fraser suddenly stopped speaking. What is it? He also asked about hidden passages. Hamish nodded, slowly. And you told him? I didn't know any, but he found one anyway. The caretaker looked genuinely distressed. I think he did. What makes you say that? The week before he left, yes, I caught him coming out of the old chapel. The chapel? He claimed he'd become lost. Hamish glanced toward the corridor leading to the concealed staircase. No, the man hadn't become lost. He had found exactly what he was looking for. Late that afternoon, Elspeth arrived with another piece of the puzzle. I've spoken to Edinburgh University, and there isn't any Professor Charles Morton in their history department. Hamish smiled faintly. I was afraid you'd say that. So he used a false name. Looks like it. Elspeth handed him a folded photograph. This came from the hotel register. It showed a distinguished-looking man in his 60s with silver hair, round spectacles, and a neatly trimmed beard. There was something familiar about him, not his face. His posture, the way he carried himself. Hamish had seen it before. Where? He studied the picture again. Then his eyes widened. The boat? What? The man Ewan saw. You can tell from a photograph. No, he tapped the picture. The walking stick? A polished black cane rested against the man's chair. Ewan had mentioned seeing someone step carefully from the cabin cruiser before the mist hid them. Not because of age, because they carried a walking stick. The detail had seemed meaningless at the time. Now it didn't. Hamish folded the photograph. We've been looking for a missing woman, but I think we've overlooked a missing man. Just then, the station telephone rang. Hamish answered. Macbeth. A frightened voice replied. It was one of Blair's detectives. Constable. Inspector Blair has disappeared. Hamish's expression changed instantly. What do you mean? Disappeared. He came back to the castle alone after receiving an anonymous letter. What letter? It claimed the missing archive had been hidden beneath St. Columba's tower. Hamish closed his eyes for the briefest moment. Someone had baited Blair. When did he leave? 2 hours ago. And now, we've found his car. Where? Outside the castle? But there is no sign of him. Hamish slowly replaced the receiver. Lugs was already standing by the door. The dog sensed it before anyone spoke. For the first time since the investigation had begun, the killer had stopped covering old tracks. They had begun making new ones. Hamish did not waste time assembling a search party. Large groups made noise. Noise frightened desperate people. He took only Lugs, a lantern, and Malcolm Fraser, whose knowledge of the castle was now almost as valuable as any map. Elspeth insisted on coming as far as the courtyard, though Hamish persuaded her to remain there and send for help only if he failed to return within the hour. If you're not back, she said quietly, I'm coming after you. I know, and don't pretend that doesn't worry you. It does, she smiled, despite herself. Good, the castle had settled into the uneasy silence that comes after midnight. Every gust of wind through the broken battlements sounded like a whispered conversation. Hamish ignored the echoes and headed straight for the concealed passage behind the chapel. Whoever had lured Blair knew about the hidden tunnels. That narrowed the field considerably. As they descended, Luggs stopped, nose pressed to the stone floor. Fresh footprints, not one person, two. One set belonged to the heavy boots Hamish had seen before. The other was unmistakably Blair's broad-soled police shoes. "So he found the passage," Fraser murmured. "Eh? The question is whether he found the way out." They followed the tracks into the chamber beneath St. Columba's tower. The empty chest still stood where Hamish had left it, but something had changed. A lantern burned on the far side of the room. Its flame flickered against the ancient stone. Someone was here. A voice drifted from the darkness. "I wondered how long it would take you." An elderly man stepped into the light, silver hair, round spectacles, a polished black walking stick, exactly as he appeared in the hotel photograph. Except the beard lay in his hand. "False," he smiled thinly. "My name isn't Charles Morton. I didn't think it was. I suppose you've guessed the rest." "Not quite." The man's smile widened. "My real name is Adrian Falk." He spoke with the calm assurance of someone who had rehearsed the truth, long before telling it. "I've spent 30 years recovering historical documents, stolen from private collections." "Recovering?" Hamish asked. "Sometimes. And sometimes stealing them back." Falk inclined his head. A matter of perspective. What was Julian Ashcombe looking for? The McFarlane archive. The records mentioned in the letter. Exactly. Falk looked toward the empty chest. They contained evidence of illegal land seizures after the 17th century. Names were altered. Families disappeared from official records. Estates changed hands through fraud, so there never was treasure. History is treasure. Hamish nodded. "I agree." Ashcombe didn't. Falk's expression hardened. He intended to sell the archive to a private collector overseas. And Evelyn Ross? She discovered his plan. So they argued, repeatedly. What happened on the night he died? For the first time, Falk hesitated. Evelyn confronted him in the entrance hall. The coffee. She accepted his invitation because she hoped to persuade him to hand over the documents. The missing cup. I removed it. Why? I didn't want Blair finding her fingerprints. Hamish studied him carefully. She didn't kill him? No. Then who did? A slow clap echoed through the chamber. Another figure emerged from the passage. Evelyn Ross. She looked exhausted, her coat torn, the shoes on her feet matching the prints Hamish had followed since the beginning. "I hoped you'd work it out," she said quietly. Hamish looked from her to Falk. "You've both been hiding." "We had no choice," Evelyn replied. Someone else was hunting the archive. Before Hamish could answer, a muffled groan came from behind a pile of fallen timbers. Blair, bound hand and foot, with a strip of cloth tied across his mouth. His furious eyes promised spectacular language the moment he was untied. Hamish removed the gag. Blair drew a tremendous breath. "I'll have every one of you arrested." "Good evening to you too," Hamish said. "It was a trap, so it appears," Falk sighed. "I tied him up," Blair spluttered. "You confessed." "I tied him up because he arrived waving a revolver and shouting before anyone could explain. You kidnapped a police officer. I prevented him being shot." Hamish's attention sharpened. "Shot by whom?" A sharp crack answered him. A bullet struck the stone arch above their heads, spraying chips of masonry across the chamber. Everyone dropped instinctively. Another shot rang out. This one shattered the lantern. Darkness swallowed the room. "Stay down," Hamish shouted. Luggs barked furiously. The dog launched toward the passage. There came a cry, the sound of a body stumbling. Then another gunshot that ricocheted harmlessly into the wall. Hamish moved without hesitation. He followed the barking through the darkness, tackling a fleeing figure just as they reached the staircase. The two crashed into the stone steps. The revolver skidded across the floor. The stranger fought hard, but without skill. Within seconds, Hamish had pinned both arms behind the man's back. Fraser arrived with another lantern. Its light revealed the face of the castle's caretaker, Malcolm Fraser. The old man looked at Hamish with weary resignation. "I almost got away." Hamish stared at him. You never left the castle, after all. Fraser laughed bitterly. I spent 27 years protecting it. And then Ashcombe arrived. His voice trembled with anger. He wanted to sell the archive piece by piece, so you killed him? I confronted him. Fraser closed his eyes. He laughed. He said, history belonged to whoever could afford it. Fraser's hands tightened. I struck him with the old stonemason's punch. The wound beneath his shoulder. He fell. I never meant. His voice failed. And the rest? Hamish asked quietly. I hid the archive. I planted the glove. I opened the west gate. I wanted everyone looking at the workers while I moved the documents. Hamish remembered every clue. The missing coffee cup removed to protect Evelyn. The planted glove. The hidden passages only a long-time caretaker could navigate. The lantern signal to Falk's boat. Everything fit. Not because of greed, because 3 different people had been pursuing 3 different goals. Ashcombe wanted profit. Falk and Evelyn wanted preservation. Fraser wanted protection. Only one of them had allowed anger to become murder. By sunrise, Dunhaw Castle was alive with police once more. Blair, now thoroughly untied and considerably embarrassed, accepted congratulations from his detectives after Hamish quietly remarked that the inspector's bold decision to revisit the castle had ultimately led to the arrest. Blair frowned. I suppose it did. It certainly helped. The inspector straightened his jacket. I had the fellow under pressure. You did. Blair seemed satisfied with that version of events. He never questioned why the official report somehow emphasized his persistence rather than Hamish's patient investigation. Hamish had written enough reports to know which details could be arranged without telling a single lie. A week later, the McFarlane archive was transferred to the National Records for Preservation, where historians could finally study documents hidden for more than 3 centuries. Evelyn Ross remained long enough to thank Hamish before returning to Edinburgh. You knew I wasn't the killer, I suspected. What convinced you? You left your suitcase. She laughed. Such a small thing. Small things usually matter. Falk accepted the consequences of his deception, but was publicly credited for helping recover the archive. As for Malcolm Fraser, the village mourned the man they had known for decades while struggling to understand the terrible choice he had made in a single moment of rage. Hamish understood it better than most. Understanding, however, was not the same as excusing. Several days later, Lochtabuff settled back into its familiar rhythm. The scaffolding still surrounded Dunhaw Castle, though the work now seemed quieter, almost respectful. Mrs. Wellington had moved on to discussing someone's escaped goat. The fishermen argued about tides instead of murder. The minister was relieved to preach about ordinary sins again. Outside the police station, Hamish sat on the stone wall overlooking the harbour, with a fresh pot of coffee balanced beside him. Lugs stretched contentedly at his feet. The telephone inside the station began to ring. Hamish listened once, twice, 3 times. He took another slow sip of coffee. It'll keep. The wind carried the scent of rain across the loch. Gulls wheeled lazily above the water, and the Highlands looked exactly as they had before murder briefly disturbed their peace. Hamish smiled to himself. The case was solved. Blair had the glory. Headquarters had forgotten to mention promotion, which, in Hamish Macbeth's view, was the happiest ending anyone could reasonably ask for.